So I don't know if I have a complete coherent thought, but I wanted to share this thought process. And then if it becomes something that I add to in the future, then great. If it's something that I'm like, no, this makes sense on its own, then great. But I just wanted to kind of, while I'm thinking, I'm like, man, I just have so many thoughts. I really just wanted to record that. Something that I'm learning is just how many times the Paul says to examine yourself and to like have an accurate representation of who you are, where you're at, what you're doing, and things like that. My first kind of like, oh, like that's dope kind of thing is when he wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:16, where he says to Timothy, keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by doing so, you will save both yourself and your hearers. And so he tells him, like, I need you to, like, look at yourself and to be able to look at what you're also saying. It's important that you're paying attention to both yourself and what you're saying. I just repeated it, but I think worthy of repetition. 2 Corinthians 13:5 then says, examine yourself to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourself, or do you not realize that this about yourself, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test. So Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he tells them to examine yourself and to test yourself. Test yourself. And what is the measure of the test? Is to examine if Christ is in you. And if he isn't, then you fail the test. That's the only test. But there's this idea of like, look at yourself, look inwardly, is Christ in you type of vibes. And then in 2 Peter 1:10-11, it says, therefore, brothers, be all the more diligent to confirm your calling and election. For if you practice these qualities, you will never fail. The idea of confirming your calling and election is this idea of intentionally looking at your work and making sure that it matches your faith. I think people always, no, not always. I've heard the argument that James and Paul are like contradicting each other, and Paul is only by faith, and James says, you need the works kind of thing. But I think a lot of times Paul says like your faith and your action should match. You should be able to examine yourself. You should have an accurate representation of yourself, being careful to like look at where you're at and assessing where you're at. And then another one in Ephesians, he says, in Ephesians 4, he says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. So walk in a manner of the calling. Walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Walking in a worthy manner. All these things to me seem like, okay, so there really isn't any excuse for me to just live whatever way that I want. There has to be a recognition of that personal responsibility, that there is a relationship that I have with God, and my personal responsibility is to make sure that I am examining myself, examining my heart, examining my motives, and having a true and accurate representation of where I'm at and how I'm maturing in Christ. I think he's given us all these like resources, and he's given us a community, and a community is very biblical, that we should not neglect to meet with one another, and he's given us accountability partners and discipleship and places to grow and video ministries and podcasts and so many things, and like all these tools. But at the end of the day, we have to have a personal responsibility to be able to examine ourselves and to know where we're at. I really like that Ephesians, the first 3 chapters are sharing the gospel, and it's the gospel that saved all of us, right? How the gospel has to come first, and it's not this trying to do a works mentality. It's not works comes first and then you like prove that you're a Christian before you're even a Christian type of vibes. It's very much the gospel came first, and then in Ephesians 4 he says, I therefore like urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. And so if the gospel is something that has saved you. And if you have life in Christ, then just that personal responsibility is there. So to make sure that you are just examining yourself always, like in knowing where you're at. I don't know. I feel like that makes sense, but I'll definitely add to it the more that I get more verses and stuff. Just wanted to make a video.